Dr. Elena Vasquez sat in her decade-old Honda Civic outside the county courthouse, staring at the auction notice taped to her passenger seat. The Blackwood Estate, 1847 Gothic Revival mansion, 47 acres, starting bid, $1. In any other circumstance, she would have laughed at the obvious catch. Properties didn't sell for $1 unless something was seriously wrong with them, but these weren't normal circumstances. 3 months ago, she'd been Dr. Elena Vasquez, tenured professor of theoretical physics at Columbia University, published researcher in quantum mechanics, and one of the few academics brave enough to seriously investigate parallel dimension theory. Now she was just Elena, unemployed and facing eviction. From her studio apartment with exactly $347 in her checking account and a cat who required prescription. Food that cost more per month than most people spent on groceries. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The university had called it budgetary restructuring. Elena knew better. Her research into dimensional rifts and parallel universe theory had made certain people uncomfortable. When she'd submitted her proposal for experimental verification of her theories, the funding had dried up overnight. When she'd pushed harder, asking pointed questions about why promising research was being terminated, her position had been eliminated entirely. "What do you think, Whiskers?" she asked the orange tabby cat, peering through the carrier's mesh door. "Mansion for $1? Too good to be true?" Whiskers, a 5-year-old rescue with mismatched eyes and an uncanny ability to sense Elena's moods, simply stared at her with his characteristic intensity. She'd found him 3 years ago outside the physics building, apparently abandoned, and he'd been her constant companion through late nights of research and early mornings of disappointment ever since. The courthouse steps were nearly empty at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Elena had expected at least a small crowd, real estate investors, developers, someone willing to take a chance on a property with potential. Instead, she found herself alone with the auctioneer, a thin man in his 60s who kept checking his watch as if he had somewhere else to be. "Well," the auctioneer said, his voice echoing off the empty steps, "we have one bidder for the Blackwood Estate. Dr. Vasquez, are you certain you want to proceed?" Elena nodded, though certainty was the last thing she felt. She'd researched the property as thoroughly as her limited resources allowed. The mansion had been built in 1847 by Theodore Blackwood, a prominent physicist of his era who'd made significant contributions to early electromagnetic theory. The property had remained in the Blackwood family until 1947, when Theodore's experiments had apparently gone wrong and he'd disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Since then, the estate had changed hands 17 times. Previous owners had reported everything from electrical anomalies to temperature fluctuations, to what the local newspaper diplomatically called unexplained phenomena. The longest anyone had managed to live there was 8 months. Both lasted less than 3, going once, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo longer than it should have. "Sold to Dr. Elena Vasquez for $1. Driving up the winding gravel road to the mansion an hour later, Elena began to understand why no one else had bid. The Blackwood Estate sat on a hill overlooking the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut, its Gothic Revival architecture creating a stark silhouette against the grey October sky. The mansion's dark stone facade was interrupted by tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch her approach like hollow eyes. Elaborate stonework decorated the corners and rooflines, but decades of neglect had left many of the decorative elements cracked or missing entirely. The grounds, once carefully landscaped, had grown wild. Ancient oak trees pressed close to the building, their branches scraping against the slate roof with each gust of wind. The circular driveway was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the ornate iron gates hung askew on their hinges. Elena parked near the front entrance and sat for a moment, studying the building she now owned. It was imposing, certainly, but she'd grown up in an old Victorian house in Massachusetts. Old buildings had personality, quirks, and stories. She could handle quirks. Whiskers, however, had other opinions. The moment Elena opened his carrier, he pressed himself against the back wall and refused to come out. His mismatched eyes, one green, one yellow, were fixed on the mansion with an intensity that made Elena's skin crawl. "Come on, buddy," she coaxed. "It's just a house." But as she spoke, she noticed the temperature drop. Not gradually, the way it might when clouds covered the sun, but suddenly, as if someone had opened an enormous freezer door. The autumn afternoon had been pleasantly warm, but now her breath misted in the air, and she could see frost forming on the car's windshield. Whiskers finally emerged from his carrier, but his behavior was unlike anything Elena had seen before. Instead of his usual curious exploration of new territory, he stayed pressed against her legs, his fur standing on end. When she took a step toward the mansion's front door, he darted ahead of her, then sat directly in her path and began to growl, a low, continuous sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "What's wrong with you?" Elena asked, but even as she spoke, she felt it too. Something about the air near the mansion felt heavy, oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the atmospheric pressure drops and every living thing seems to hold its breath. The front door was solid oak, 12 feet tall and fitted with iron hardware that looked original to the building. The key, provided by the county clerk, turned easily in the lock, but the door itself required Elena's full weight to push open. It swung inward with a groan that echoed through what appeared to be a grand foyer. Elena stepped inside and immediately understood why the previous owners had left so quickly. The temperature inside the mansion wasn't just cold, it was actively hostile. The foyer, which should have been warmer than the outside air, felt like the interior of a meat locker, but it wasn't consistently cold. As Elena moved through the space, she encountered pockets of frigid air that seemed to have no source, followed by areas that felt almost tropical in comparison. The mansion's interior was a study in faded grandeur. The foyer featured a sweeping staircase with an ornate iron banister that curved upward into shadows. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, though most of the crystal pendants were missing or broken. The walls were paneled in dark wood that had been stained nearly black with age, and the few windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked most of the natural light. But it was the electrical system that truly defied explanation. Elena flipped the switch near the front door, and half the foyer blazed with light from a chandelier that appeared to be in perfect working order. The other half remained in darkness, despite having identical fixtures. She tried the switches for the adjoining rooms with similar results. Some worked perfectly, others appeared to be completely dead, and a few seemed to operate on some kind of random pattern that changed each time she tested them. Whiskers had followed her inside, but refused to move beyond the foyer. He sat near the front door, his tail twitching with agitation, and watched Elena's every movement as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. "Okay," Elena said aloud, partly to reassure herself and partly because the silence in the mansion felt oppressive. "So we have temperature variations, electrical anomalies, and one very unhappy cat. This is still better than being homeless." She pulled out the small notebook she always carried and began documenting her observations. Temperature variations of 20-30 degrees within a 10-foot radius. Electrical systems that operated according to no pattern she could discern. And something else, a sound almost below the threshold of hearing, like a massive machine running somewhere deep within the building. As she explored the ground floor, Elena discovered that the mansion had been extensively modified from its original design. What should have been a formal dining room had been converted into some kind of laboratory space. The walls were lined with equipment cabinets, most of them empty, and the floor showed the mounting points for heavy machinery that had been removed decades ago. A brass nameplate on one of the remaining pieces of equipment read, "Property of Theodore Blackwood, Ph.D., Experimental Physics Laboratory." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mansion's erratic temperature control. Theodore Blackwood had been conducting experiments in this house. Experiments important enough to convert formal living spaces into laboratory facilities. Experiments that had apparently gone wrong in 1947, leading to his disappearance and the mansion's reputation for unexplained phenomena. As daylight faded outside, Elena made a disturbing discovery about the mansion's electrical system. It wasn't random, it was reactive. The lights that worked during her initial exploration began to flicker and fail as darkness fell outside. But other lights, ones that had been completely dead during the day, began to glow with a soft bluish radiance that seemed to come from within the bulbs themselves rather than from any normal electrical current. By midnight, Elena was beginning to understand why 17 previous owners had fled the Blackwood Estate. She sat in what had once been the mansion's library, wrapped in a sleeping bag she'd brought from her apartment, trying to make sense of the readings on her portable electromagnetic field detector, the device designed to measure the kind of ambient electromagnetic radiation found around power lines or radio transmitters, was registering readings that shouldn't exist. The levels fluctuated wildly, spiking to dangerous levels before dropping to virtually nothing, then climbing again according to no pattern she could identify. But what disturbed her most was Whisker's behavior. Her normally social, affectionate cat had spent the entire evening positioned between Elena and the rest of the house, as if protecting her from something only he could sense. Every few minutes he would turn toward the mansion's interior and growl at empty air, his fur standing on end. "What do you see that I don't?" Elena whispered, scratching behind his ears, as if in response to her question. The electromagnetic readings on her detector suddenly spiked to levels that made the device emit a high-pitched warning tone. At the same moment, every light in the mansion flickered in perfect synchronization, and Elena could swear she heard footsteps echoing from the floor above. Elena woke to the sound of her equipment alarms at 3:47 a.m. The electromagnetic field detector was screaming warnings about radiation levels that exceeded its maximum measurement capacity, while her digital thermometer showed temperature readings that fluctuated between 15 degrees Celsius and 97 degrees Celsius with no apparent pattern. She sat up in her sleeping bag, disoriented and cold, despite wearing every layer of clothing she'd brought. Whiskers was pressed against her side, trembling in a way she'd never seen before. His mismatched eyes reflected the strange blue glow that had replaced the normal electric lighting throughout parts of the mansion. The footsteps she'd heard before midnight had continued intermittently throughout the night. Measured, deliberate sounds from the floor above that couldn't be explained by settling wood or thermal expansion. Elena had a PhD in physics. She understood the difference between the random creaking of an old building and the purposeful movement of something that had weight and intention. But when she'd climbed the stairs to investigate, she'd found nothing. The second floor was empty, covered in dust that showed no footprints or disturbances. The floorboards were solid, showing no signs of the kind of movement that would produce the sounds she was hearing below. More disturbing were the electromagnetic readings. Elena had spent her career studying theoretical physics, but the measurements she was recording defied every principle of electromagnetic theory she knew. The readings weren't just anomalous, they were impossible. The detector was registering field strengths that would require massive electrical generators. Yet there was no power source in the mansion capable of producing such energy. As dawn broke over the mansion, Elena decided to expand her investigation. She needed better equipment, more sophisticated measuring devices, and access to research materials that could help her understand what she was dealing with. Her first call was to Dr. James Morton, her former mentor at Columbia. "Elena?" Morton's voice was cautious when he answered his phone. "I didn't expect to hear from you. Professor, I need to borrow some equipment. Electromagnetic sensors, maybe a spectrum analyzer if you have access to one." I'm investigating some unusual phenomena and, Elena, I'm going to stop you right there. Morton's tone shifted from cautious to cold. Whatever you're working on, leave it alone. Some research isn't worth pursuing. What are you talking about? You don't even know what I'm investigating. There was a long pause before Morton responded. The Blackwood Estate. You bought the Blackwood Estate, didn't you? Elena felt her blood turn to ice. She hadn't mentioned the location, hadn't given any details about her research. How did you know that? Elena, listen to me very carefully. Pack your things and leave that place immediately. Don't ask questions. Don't try to understand what's happening there. Just leave. The line went dead. Elena stared at her phone, trying to process what had just happened. Morton had known exactly where she was calling from, and he'd warned her off with the kind of urgency that suggested genuine fear. But how could he possibly know about the Blackwood Estate? She'd never mentioned her plans to him, and the property purchase had been completed less than 24 hours ago. Her next 3 calls to former colleagues yielded similar results. Professor Davidson at MIT claimed his equipment was unavailable for lending. Dr. Richardson at Harvard was too busy to discuss research. Collaborations. Dr. Chen at Yale simply hung up when Elena mentioned she was calling about unusual electromagnetic phenomena. By noon, Elena realized that her academic isolation was more complete than she'd imagined. It wasn't just that her research funding had been terminated. She'd been effectively blacklisted from the entire scientific community. Colleagues who had once been eager to collaborate were now treating her like a pariah. And somehow, they all knew about her connection to the Blackwood Estate. Frustrated but not defeated, Elena decided to investigate the mansion's history. If she couldn't get help from her colleagues, she could at least learn more about Theodore Blackwood and his experiments. She drove into Millbrook, population 847, according to the welcome sign, and found the local library housed in a converted Victorian house on Main Street. The librarian, a middle-aged Asian man named Marcus Chen, seemed nervous the moment Elena introduced herself as the new owner of the Blackwood Estate. You actually bought that place? He asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Most people just drive by and keep going. I'm researching the property's history, Eleanor explained. Specifically, I'm interested in Theodore Blackwood and his work. I understand he was conducting experiments there in the 1940s. Marcus's expression grew even more uncomfortable. I can show you what we have in the public archives, but most of the records about the Blackwood family are incomplete. He led Eleanor to a small research room lined with filing cabinets and microfiche readers. The files he produced were thin and heavily redacted. Newspaper articles from the 1940s mentioned Theodore Blackwood's disappearance in the most general terms, with few specifics about the circumstances. His obituary, published in 1948, was limited to basic biographical information and made no mention of his scientific work. But Elena's training in research methodology helped her notice what was missing. The gaps in the record were too clean, too systematic. Entire newspaper issues were missing from the library's archives, particularly those from the weeks surrounding Blackwood's disappearance. Documents that should have been filed with the county clerk's office were nowhere to be found. It was as if someone had carefully scrubbed the historical record of any meaningful information about Theodore Blackwood's final experiments. Mr. Chen, Eleanor said as she returned the files, do you know anything about what Theodore Blackwood was actually working on? The equipment I found in the mansion suggests he was conducting some kind of advanced research. Marcus glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer to Elena. My grandfather worked for Theodore Blackwood, he said quietly. He never talked about it, but after he died I found some of his personal papers. There are things about that place. Things people in town prefer not to discuss. What kind of things? People disappearing, lights in the sky over the mansion, strange sounds that could be heard for miles. And after Blackwood vanished, the phenomena didn't stop. They got worse. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. Has anyone else tried to investigate? Other scientists, researchers? Over the years, yes. But they never stayed long, and some of them, Marcus hesitated, some of them never left at all. Elena drove back to the mansion with more questions than answers. Their historical record had been deliberately obscured. Her former colleagues were afraid to help her, and the local community clearly knew more than they were willing to share. But her scientific training told her that the phenomena she was experiencing were real and measurable, even if they defied conventional explanation. That evening, as she continued her systematic documentation of the mansion's anomalies, Elena made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring the mansion's basement, she found evidence of extensive recent activity. The basement had been converted into additional laboratory space, with equipment mounting points that showed signs of recent use. The dust patterns on the floor indicated that heavy machinery had been moved in and out of the space within the past few months. More disturbing was what she found hidden behind a false wall panel, surveillance equipment, sophisticated cameras, and recording devices that were clearly modern, probably installed within the last few years. The devices appeared to be inactive, but their presence meant that someone had been monitoring the mansion long before Elena's arrival. As midnight approached, Elena was beginning to understand that she wasn't dealing with simple electromagnetic anomalies or structural problems with an old building. The Blackwood Estate was the center of something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Theodore Blackwood's experiments had apparently attracted ongoing attention from parties unknown, and her purchase of the property had put her directly in the middle of a situation she was only beginning to comprehend. The electromagnetic readings from her equipment were becoming more intense, and Whiskers had spent the entire evening positioned between Elena and the mansion's interior rooms, as if guarding against something only he could sense. At 11:47 p.m., Elena's equipment registered the highest electromagnetic readings she'd recorded yet. Every light in the mansion flickered in synchronized patterns, and the temperature throughout the building dropped by 15 degrees in less than 30 seconds. And in that moment of maximum electromagnetic activity, Elena saw something that would change her understanding of reality forever. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The electromagnetic storm that struck the mansion at 11:47 p.m. was unlike anything Elena had ever witnessed. Her field detector didn't just register high readings, it maxed out completely, its digital display showing only error messages as the needle pegged against the maximum measurement mark. The temperature throughout the mansion plummeted so rapidly that Elena's breath misted in the air, and every electronic device she'd brought began to malfunction simultaneously. But it was what Elena saw during the peak of the electromagnetic disturbance that shattered her scientific worldview entirely. Standing in the mansion's main foyer, translucent and flickering like a badly tuned television signal, was a figure that appeared to be herself. The apparition was unmistakably Elena, same height, same build, same dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail. But this other Elena wore clothes she'd never owned, a lab coat over what appeared to be some kind of protective suit, and her face showed a level of exhaustion and terror that Elena had never experienced. "You have to." The figure's voice came through waves of static, as if transmitted across vast distances through a damaged radio. "The rifts are expanding." Elena stood frozen, her rational mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Hallucinations were possible under extreme stress, but Whiskers was reacting to the apparition as well. Her cat had positioned himself between Elena and the translucent figure, his fur standing on end as he growled at something he could clearly perceive. "Who are you?" Elena managed to ask, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. The figure turned toward her, and Elena found herself looking into eyes that were identical to her own, but filled with knowledge of something terrible. I'm you," From parallel dimension, listen carefully. Time is. The transmission cut out for several seconds, the figure flickering in and out of visibility as the electromagnetic readings fluctuated wildly. They're coming. Cross. Project Gateway. Find the control room before they... Stop you! Who's coming? What control room? Elena stepped closer, but the figure raised a warning hand. Don't. Closer. Dimensional barriers. Unstable. Each contact makes it worse. The other, Elena's voice, was becoming clearer as the electromagnetic storm intensified. Theodore Blackwood. Experiments succeeded. Too well. Rifts between realities, growing larger. My universe, already destroyed. Elena's mind reeled as she tried to process the implications. Parallel dimensions weren't just theoretical. They were real and somehow accessible through whatever technology Theodore Blackwood had developed. The figure claiming to be her from another reality was proof that the experiments had succeeded, but apparently with catastrophic consequences. The control room, Echo continued, her form becoming more solid as the electromagnetic field reached new peak levels. Hidden. Behind the library. Fathers, your Blackwoods. Complete research. You can stop. Cascade failure, but they know you're here now. They? Government. Secret division. Using the rifts for decades. Elimination. Disposal. They think they control it, but... Echo's image flickered violently. Reality itself is breaking down if the rifts expand further. The electromagnetic storm reached its peak intensity, and for a moment, Echo appeared almost completely solid. Elena could see the desperation in her counterpart's eyes, the weight of knowledge that had cost everything. "Find Dorothy Blackwood," Echo said with sudden clarity. "Theodore's daughter. She's alive, hiding, has the activation keys. Without them, the control systems won't." The storm collapsed as suddenly as it had begun. The electromagnetic readings dropped to normal levels. The temperature in the mansion rose to merely uncomfortably cold, and Echo vanished like smoke, leaving Elena alone with Whiskers and the overwhelming knowledge that everything she thought she understood about reality was wrong. Elena sat down heavily in one of the mansion's antique chairs, trying to organize her thoughts. If Echo was telling the truth, and the evidence suggested she was, then the Blackwood Estate was ground zero for experiments that had successfully opened doorways between parallel dimensions. The supernatural phenomena she'd been documenting weren't supernatural at all. They were the side effects of unstable rifts in the fabric of space-time itself. More importantly, if Echo's warnings were accurate, Elena wasn't alone in knowing about the dimensional technology. Some government division had been using the rifts for their own purposes, and they were apparently aware of her presence at the mansion. Following Echo's guidance, Elena searched behind the mansion's library and found exactly what she'd been told to look for. A hidden panel in the wall, operated by a mechanism disguised as part of the room's decorative molding, opened to reveal a passage that led to Theodore Blackwood's true laboratory. The hidden laboratory was a marvel of 1940s engineering combined with technology that seemed decades ahead of its time. The walls were lined with equipment cabinets filled with devices Elena couldn't immediately identify. Massive control panels dominated one wall, their switches and dials labeled with terminology that mixed standard electrical engineering with concepts she'd only encountered in theoretical physics papers. But it was Theodore Blackwood's research notes that provided the key to understanding what she was dealing with. The journals, preserved in airtight containers, documented years of systematic experimentation with what Blackwood called dimensional membrane theory. His early experiments had focused on detecting and measuring the barriers between parallel realities. His later work had successfully developed technology to create small, controlled rifts in those barriers. According to his notes, Blackwood's experiments had attracted government attention as early as 1944, Military officials had approached him about weaponizing his discoveries, suggesting applications for elimination of enemy personnel and disposal of sensitive materials. Blackwood had initially cooperated, but his final entries suggested growing alarm about the stability of the dimensional rifts. The last entry, dated February 15, 1947, was written in handwriting that showed clear signs of stress. The barriers are weakening. Each time we open a rift, it becomes easier to open the next one, but harder to close them completely. I fear we may be approaching a cascade failure that would merge multiple realities into an unstable overlap. I've tried to explain to the military liaisons that we must stop the experiments immediately, but they refuse to listen. They want to expand the program to multiple sites. God help us all, I may have opened a door that cannot be closed. Elena realized that Echo's warnings had been accurate in every detail. Theodore Blackwood's experiments had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but the technology was inherently unstable. Each use of the dimensional rifts weakened the barriers between realities, making catastrophic failure increasingly likely. And if a secret government division had been using the rifts for 70 years, the accumulated damage might already be beyond repair. As Elena studied Blackwood's control systems, trying to understand how they functioned, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Several of the devices showed signs of recent use. Switches had been moved from positions shown in Blackwood's final photographs, and dust patterns indicated that someone had been operating the equipment within the past few months. The surveillance equipment she'd found earlier made sudden, terrifying sense. Someone had been monitoring the mansion not just to watch for trespassers, but to ensure that the dimensional technology remained available for their use. Elena was beginning to understand that her purchase of the Blackwood Estate hadn't been the lucky break she'd thought. She'd walked directly into the middle of a situation that could threaten the stability of reality itself, and powerful people with their own agendas were already aware of her presence. Outside, Whiskers began growling again, but this time his attention was focused on the mansion's grounds rather than its interior. Through the laboratory's small windows, Elena could see lights moving through the trees that surrounded the property. Not flashlights or vehicle headlights, steady, purposeful illumination that suggested professional surveillance equipment. Echo's warning echoed in her mind. They're coming. Elena realized that her time for undisturbed research was about to end. If she was going to understand Theodore Blackwood's dimensional technology well enough to prevent the cascade failure Echo had warned about, she would have to do it while evading the attention of people who had been using the rifts for their own purposes for decades, and based on what she'd learned about the fate of previous researchers who'd investigated the Blackwood Estate. Those people were willing to eliminate anyone who threatened their operation. Elena spent the early morning hours after her encounter with Echo methodically searching the mansion for surveillance equipment. What she found was more sophisticated than anything she'd imagined. Hidden cameras disguised as decorative elements were embedded throughout the building, in light fixtures, behind picture frames, even built into the ornate molding that lined the walls. The devices were professional-grade, military specification equipment that would have cost more than Elena's annual salary as a professor. But what disturbed her most was that the surveillance system was still active. LED indicators on several devices showed they were currently recording, which meant someone was monitoring her activities in real time. The thought that her every movement had been watched since her arrival made her skin crawl. But it also explained how her former colleagues had known about her connection to the Blackwood Estate so quickly. At 8:30 a.m., Elena's doorbell rang. The woman standing on the mansion's front steps was tall and elegantly dressed, with silver hair pulled back in a severe chignon and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of Elena's appearance. She wore a dark suit that screamed federal government and carried herself with the kind of authority that came from years of being obeyed without question. "Dr. Vasquez," The woman's voice was cultured, professional, with just a hint of a southern accent. "I'm Agent Sarah Cross, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'd like to discuss some safety concerns regarding this property." Elena's heart rate spiked, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What kind of safety concerns?" "May I come in?" "This is rather sensitive information." Elena stepped aside reluctantly, noting how Cross's eyes immediately swept the foyer, taking in details with the systematic attention of someone conducting surveillance. Her gaze lingered on the areas where Elena had found hidden cameras, and Elena realized with growing alarm that Cross was checking to ensure her surveillance network was still functional. "Dr. Vasquez," Cross began, settling into one of the mansion's antique chairs as if she owned the place. "I understand you've recently acquired this property. I'm afraid you may not be aware of its rather troubled history." "I've done some research," Elena replied carefully. "The previous owners experienced various difficulties." Cross smiled, but it was the kind of expression that never reached her eyes. "Difficulties is a polite way of putting it. This property has been associated with 17 disappearances over the past 70 years. People who spend extended periods here have a tendency to simply vanish." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mansion's erratic temperature control. "Are you suggesting the property is dangerous?" "I'm stating that it is. The electromagnetic anomalies alone pose serious health risks. Prolonged exposure to the kind of radiation this building generates can cause hallucinations, paranoia, and in extreme cases, complete psychological breakdown." Cross leaned forward slightly. "We've been monitoring this location for decades as part of an ongoing safety assessment. The casual admission that the government had been conducting surveillance on the property confirmed Elena's worst suspicions. Cross wasn't here to protect her. She was here to assess what Elena had discovered and determine whether she represented a threat to whatever operation was being conducted at the mansion. "What kind of monitoring?" Elena asked. "The usual environmental assessments. Electromagnetic readings, atmospheric analysis, structural integrity surveys. Nothing too invasive, but we do need to ensure public safety." Cross's tone was conversational, but Elena caught the underlying warning. "Which brings me to why I'm here today. We'd be happy to relocate you to more suitable accommodations while we complete our assessment." Elena recognized the offer for what it was, an ultimatum disguised as assistance. "What if I prefer to stay?" Cross's smile became more predatory. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand you've had some professional setbacks recently. Academic positions can be difficult to replace, especially when one's research has moved into controversial territories. It would be unfortunate if your current situation were to become even more challenging." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cross knew about Elena's academic blacklisting and was implying she had the power to make Elena's situation worse. The message was clear: cooperate or face consequences that would extend far beyond the Blackwood Estate. Elena's phone rang, interrupting the tense conversation. The caller ID showed a local number. "Dr. Vasquez, this is Detective Raymond Torres with the Millbrook Police Department. I'd like to speak with you about your recent property acquisition, if you have a few minutes." Elena glanced at Cross, who was listening intently to the phone conversation. "I'm actually speaking with a federal agent right now about the property. Could you call back later?" "Actually, Mom, I think you might want to hear this immediately. It concerns 3 missing persons cases that are directly related to the Blackwood Estate." Cross stood up abruptly, her composed facade slipping for the first time since her arrival. "Dr. Vasquez, I really think you should focus on our conversation right now. Local law enforcement can sometimes misinterpret complex situations, but Elena was already answering the detective's call." "What kind of missing persons cases?" "People who made inquiries about purchasing the estate over the past 5 years. All 3 disappeared within weeks of their initial contact with the real estate office. Their vehicles were found abandoned, but no bodies were ever recovered." Torres's voice carried the frustration of an investigator who'd hit too many dead ends. I understand you actually completed the purchase yesterday. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. 3 people had vanished simply for expressing interest in buying the property. She looked at Cross, who was now openly hostile. Her pretense of concern completely abandoned. Detective Torres, Elena said carefully, aware that Cross was listening to every word. I think I'd like to speak with you in person. Are you available this afternoon? I can be there in 30 minutes. As Elena ended the call, Cross moved toward the door with the purposeful stride of someone whose plans had been disrupted. Dr. Vasquez, I strongly advise against involving local law enforcement in federal matters. Detective Torres doesn't have the clearance level to understand what's really happening here. And what is really happening here? Cross paused at the door, her pale eyes fixed on Elena with calculating intensity. You've stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than you can imagine. The smart thing would be to accept our relocation offer and forget about this place entirely. The alternative, she let the threat hang in the air. Well, let's just say that 17 people have already discovered what happens to those who ask too many questions about the Blackwood Estate. After Cross left, Elena spent the time before Detective Torres's arrival documenting everything she could remember about the conversation. Cross had essentially admitted that the federal government was conducting ongoing operations at the mansion, that they'd been monitoring it for decades, and that they were willing to eliminate people who threatened their activities. Elena also made a disturbing discovery while searching the mansion's basement laboratory. Several pieces of equipment showed signs of recent use, control settings that didn't match Theodore Blackwood's final configurations, and dust patterns indicating that machinery had been moved and operated within the past few months. Someone had been using the dimensional rift technology, and based on Cross's implications about people who disappeared, Elena was beginning to understand for what purpose. When Detective Torres arrived, Elena immediately understood why Cross had been concerned about his involvement. Torres was clearly an experienced investigator with the kind of methodical approach that would eventually uncover the truth about the mansion's real purpose. Dr. Vasquez, I'll be direct with you, Torres said, as they sat in the mansion's library. 3 people have vanished after showing interest in this property, and now you've actually moved in. Either you're extremely brave, or you don't understand what you've gotten yourself into. Elena decided to trust the detective with at least part of the truth. I've discovered that this property has been under federal surveillance for decades. Agent Cross just tried to pressure me into leaving, implying that asking questions about this place can be hazardous to one's health. Torres's expression grew grimmer. Agent Cross, tall woman, silver hair, acts like she owns whatever room she's in. You know her? She's been in town several times over the past few years, always around the time someone goes missing. Claims to be FBI, but when I try to verify her credentials through official channels, I get stonewalled. Torres pulled out a notebook and began writing. Tell me everything you can remember about your conversation with her. As Elena recounted Cross's visit, Torres asked increasingly pointed questions about the federal surveillance operation and the nature of the threats Cross had made. It became clear that Torres suspected the disappearances were connected to some kind of government cover-up, but he lacked the evidence to prove it. Dr. Vasquez, Torres said finally, I think you should consider leaving this place, at least temporarily. Whatever's happening here, it's gotten 3 people killed, and Cross's people seem willing to eliminate anyone who gets too close to the truth. Elena realized she was at a crucial decision point. She could take Torres's advice and flee, abandoning her investigation and accepting that she would never understand what had happened to Theodore Blackwood or what was causing the dimensional rifts. Or she could stay and risk becoming the 4th person to disappear for asking the wrong questions. But Echo's warnings echoed in her mind. If the dimensional rifts were truly destabilizing reality itself, then Elena might be the only person with both the scientific knowledge and the access to prevent a catastrophic cascade failure. Fleeing might preserve her personal safety, but it could doom not just this reality, but multiple parallel universes. Detective Torres, Elena said carefully, what would you need to build a case against Cross and her operation? Torres looked surprised by the question. Evidence of federal crimes, documentation of the surveillance operation, proof that the missing persons cases are connected to government activities rather than simple disappearances. He studied Elena's face. Are you thinking of staying here and trying to gather that evidence? Elena nodded, though every rational part of her mind was screaming that she was making a terrible mistake. I think what's happening at this mansion is bigger than just 3 missing persons cases. If Cross and her people are using some kind of technology here for elimination purposes, we need to expose it. Torres was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks. If you're going to do this, you'll need help, and you'll need to be very, very careful. Cross strikes me as someone who's eliminated problems before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. As Torres prepared to leave, Elena made a decision that would change the trajectory of her investigation entirely. Detective, there's something else you should know. I have reason to believe that the federal operation at this mansion involves technology that's far more advanced and dangerous than simple surveillance equipment. If I can find concrete evidence of what they're really doing here, would you be willing to help me expose it? Torres met her gaze directly. Dr. Vasquez, if the federal government is using this property to eliminate American citizens, then exposing that operation becomes a matter of law enforcement duty, regardless of the personal risk. After Torres left, Elena realized that her situation had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a solitary academic investigating strange phenomena. She was now actively opposing a government operation that had been eliminating witnesses for decades, with only a local detective as her ally against resources and authority she couldn't begin to match. But she also knew that Cross's reaction to Torres's involvement had revealed a crucial weakness. The federal operation was compartmentalized and secretive enough that it couldn't withstand official law enforcement scrutiny. If Elena could gather enough evidence to support Torres's investigation, they might be able to expose the entire conspiracy. That evening, as Elena continued her documentation of the mansion's dimensional anomalies, she realized that Cross's visit had answered one crucial question. The government knew exactly what Theodore Blackwood's technology could do, and they'd been using it for their own purposes for 70 years. The question now was whether Elena could stay alive long enough to prove it. Elena knew she needed allies, and Marcus Chen's nervous reaction at the library suggested he knew more about the Blackwood Estate than he'd been willing to share. The next morning, she drove back to Millbrook with a specific plan. Convince the librarian to trust her with whatever secrets his family had been keeping for generations. She found Marcus organizing returned books at the circulation desk, his movements tense and watchful. The moment he saw Elena, his expression shifted to something that bordered on panic. "Dr. Vasquez," he said quietly, glancing around the empty library. "You shouldn't have come back here. People are asking questions about your visit yesterday." "What kind of people?" Marcus gestured for her to follow him to the back office, a cramped space lined with boxes of archived materials and outdated computer equipment. He closed the door carefully and checked that the blinds were drawn before speaking. "Federal agents. They wanted to know what materials you'd requested, what questions you'd asked, how long you'd stayed." Marcus sat down heavily behind his desk. "Dr. Vasquez, my family has been keeping certain secrets about the Blackwood Estate for 3 generations. I think it's time you learned the truth." Elena felt a surge of hope. "Your grandfather really did work for Theodore Blackwood?" "More than that. My grandfather, Chen Wei-Ming, was Blackwood's research partner. He was there when the first dimensional rift was successfully opened. He was also there when everything went wrong." Marcus unlocked a desk drawer and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "These are his personal records of the experiments. Records that were supposed to be destroyed in 1947. Elena opened the journal carefully, noting that many of the entries were written in both English and Chinese. The early pages documented systematic experiments with what Chen Wei-ming called membrane resonance theory, attempts to detect and measure the barriers between parallel realities. But it was the entries from 1946 that made Elena's blood run cold. October 15th, 1946. First successful portal maintained for 17 minutes. Dr. Blackwood insists on expanding the aperture despite my concerns about dimensional stability. The military observers are pushing for weaponization applications. November 3rd, 1946. Portal remains open for over 3 hours. We have successfully sent objects through to the parallel dimension and retrieved them. But I am detecting resonance patterns that suggest the barriers are becoming permanently weakened. Dr. Blackwood dismisses my concerns. December 12th, 1946. The military has taken operational control of the project. They are no longer interested in scientific research. They want a disposal system for sensitive materials and eliminated personnel. I have tried to explain that each use of the technology makes catastrophic failure more likely, but they will not listen. Elena looked up from the journal, her mind racing. Your grandfather tried to stop the experiments? Marcus nodded grimly. He realized before anyone else that the dimensional rifts were inherently unstable. Each time they opened a portal, it became easier to open the next one, but harder to control where it led, or what might come through from the other side. Elena turned to the journal's final entries, dated in early 1947. February 10th, 1947. Dr. Blackwood has discovered that the military is using our technology to eliminate political dissidents. People who ask inconvenient questions about government programs are being pushed through the rifts, officially listed as disappearances. Blackwood is horrified and has threatened to expose the entire operation. February 14th, 1947. Dr. Blackwood is dead. The official story will be that he disappeared during an experiment gone wrong, but I saw the gunshot wound before they moved his body. He was murdered by Colonel Harrison's men after he threatened to contact the press about the elimination program. February 16th, 1947. I am fleeing tonight with my family. Colonel Harrison has made it clear that all witnesses to the project will be eliminated. I'm leaving this record with instructions that it should never be revealed unless the dimensional experiments resume. If someone is reading this, it means the rifts are active again, and God help us all. Elena stared at the journal, trying to process the implications. Theodore Blackwood hadn't disappeared in a scientific accident. He'd been murdered by his own government for trying to expose the military's use of his dimensional technology. And the program he died trying to stop had apparently continued operating for 70 years. Marcus, Elena said slowly. Agent Cross told me yesterday that 17 people have disappeared in connection with the Blackwood Estate. If your grandfather's account is accurate, they weren't disappearances, Marcus finished. They were eliminations. People who got too close to understanding what the government was really doing at the mansion. Marcus pulled out another box of materials, photographs, documents, and what appeared to be technical diagrams. My grandfather didn't just keep records. He also took blueprints of the dimensional equipment before he fled. He knew that someday someone might need to understand how the technology worked. The technical documents were remarkably detailed, showing the construction and operation of devices that seemed decades ahead of 1940s technology. Elena recognized some of the principles from her own theoretical research, but the practical applications were far more advanced than anything she'd imagined possible. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. My grandfather's final entry mentions that Theodore Blackwood had a daughter. Dorothy Blackwood was 16 when her father was killed, and she supposedly died in a car accident 2 weeks later. Supposedly?